Matt slowly stepped through the snow-covered park, looking confusedly at the snow slipping under his boots. It was one of those winter evenings when the snow falls so thickly that time seems to slow down, and everything around him is shrouded in mist. He had just finished his classes at college and was hurrying home. Walks through this park had become part of his daily routine, but today something felt off. The snow was falling relentlessly, and it was difficult to make out even the smallest details of the surrounding world. The wind's whistle reached him through the narrow alleys, and he felt each step echoing in the quiet, silent world around him. It was one of those places he loved, cozy, but in a way, eerie. For decades, almost nothing had changed here, the same trees covered in snow, benches that hardly anyone used, and paths leading deep into the park. Matt didn't like walking these paths after sunset, because in the winter, it got dark quickly. But today, he decided to make an exception. The snowy space looked inviting. He reached the spot where he always liked to stop and gaze at the old fountain that hadn't worked in years. It was a beautiful sight, but even it couldn't make him enjoy the moment now. And then he heard footsteps behind him. At first, it was just the quiet scraping of snow beneath something heavy, but with each new step, the sound became clearer. He turned his head, but no one was there. Or maybe he had missed something, since the snow was so thick that visibility was difficult. But with each step, the fear crept closer. Something was wrong. He couldn't quite understand what, but he felt the familiar cold in his stomach, the one that never leaves those who feel eyes on them. Matt quickened his pace, trying not to look back. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, that it was just the wind or the sounds of people accidentally entering the park like he had. And then, shadow. He heard the footsteps again. This time, they sounded like they were following him with every turn he made. He couldn't take it anymore, and this time he stopped to look behind him. Nothing. Empty. But when he started moving again, his heart jumped in his chest. Just a few steps, and he noticed a man standing at the end of the alley, looking at him. His face was expressionless, but Matt could clearly see that the stranger was dressed unusually for the season, a simple jacket, but he looked as if he were lost. Something in his posture exuded threat, even though there was no obvious reason to be afraid. Matt walked faster but couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't just standing there waiting for no reason. That evening, Matt returned home and tried to forget what had happened in the park. The man who had been watching him disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Still, the young man couldn't shake the feeling of unease about the place. The next day, he walked through the same park, but this time he carefully chose his paths, trying not to encounter the stranger again. But again. The same footsteps. At first, quiet, almost inaudible, but gradually increasing. Matt tried to act as though he hadn't noticed. He couldn't bring himself to turn around to check if someone was behind him. With each passing day, the situation repeated itself, and the man always appeared at the same time and in the same place. This wasn't a simple coincidence, but why? Why had he started following him? And why had it all started after that evening in the park? Each day, Matt began noticing more strange things. The man seemed to stalk him, walking the same path and always looking like he was waiting for something. Who was this person? And why did his presence seem so terrifying? A month passed, and this nightmare repeated every day. Matt could no longer shake the constant sense of danger and had firmly decided to find out who the man behind those stairs was. But no encounter with him provided any answers. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more lurking in the shadows of his fears? This was just the beginning. Now, Matt was facing the true purpose of the man. And it was only the beginning. A few days after the last encounter with the stranger, Matt began to feel increasingly anxious. His evenings no longer felt peaceful. Every time he walked through the park, he felt his sense of security slipping away. He could no longer ignore the strange events happening around him. Every sign and signal seemed suspicious. Matt noticed that the man he had seen before started appearing in other places, not just the park. He saw him near his university, at bus stops, even around the corner of his building. Each time, the man would look at him but never approach. And even though he made no aggressive moves, the feeling of fear and unease from the constant surveillance never went away. Matt tried to think logically. He studied the routes he took and tried to determine if this could just be a coincidence. But every time he decided to take an alternative path, it seemed like the stranger was taking the same paths as well. One evening, as Matt was leaving the university, he spotted him. The man was standing behind a tree near the entrance to the university grounds. Again, his face was expressionless, and his posture unchanged. But this time, there was something new in his gaze. He wasn't just standing there. He was looking at Matt as if his eyes were trying to look inside, as though they wanted to penetrate his very essence. Without making a sound, he began following him. This time, Matt decided to go to the police. He went to the station and briefly explained his story. At first, he felt like they were dismissing him as someone making up problems, but when he mentioned details that suggested it was more than just a coincidence, the authorities took his statement seriously. They promised to conduct an investigation, and Matt felt relieved. He was no longer alone in his fight against the man. However, when he returned home that evening, he discovered that his apartment door was not locked, and there was a distinct scent of unfamiliar perfume in the room. His heart sank with terror. Matt immediately called the police. He didn't want to leave anything to chance. But when the officers arrived, they found no evidence that anyone had breached his privacy. All traces vanished, as if no crime had been committed. But Matt knew he wasn't imagining it. He couldn't stop now. The man seemed to have the power to make the whole world revolve around him. Climax: that same week, Matt decided to change his life and take a step towards uncovering the mystery. He arranged for surveillance. He was going to gather evidence that would prove he wasn't in a state of psychosis. He could no longer live in constant fear and decided to take action. One night, he woke up to the sound of someone quietly tapping on his window. His heart froze in his chest. It was the same sound, footsteps echoing when everything else was silent. He approached the window, but could see nothing. Only darkness. A sharp phone rang. Matt walked over to it, and a new message appeared on the screen: "You won't be going home tonight." It was from an unknown number. That same evening, the man appeared again. Matt stepped outside, but at that moment, the bright headlights of a car flashed. Matt recognized him. The man he had seen all this time was sitting in the driver's seat, his gaze unwavering. Matt tried to run, but his legs didn't move as fast as he wanted. And then, he heard the voice behind him: "You can't escape from someone who knows you." The events began to unfold quickly. Matt realized he no longer had time for doubts. All the threads led to this man. It turned out this wasn't just stalking, but part of a larger scheme he hadn't recognized earlier. The stranger's expression changed when they locked eyes. The man said, "You didn't realize how you became part of this game?" Only now, as Matt tried to flee, did he understand that every step he took, every choice he made, had been part of the mysterious man's plan. Now that all the masks were off, Matt realized that behind all these events was not just a random stalker, but part of a conspiracy he hadn't even suspected until that moment. And now he had to find a way to break free from this trap. Matt stands frozen, as if glued to the pavement, when the car pulls up closer. The cabin lights up with a cold blue glow from the headlights, and he sees the stranger. The man rolls down the window, and without breaking his gaze, says, "You know why I'm doing this, right? You didn't realize it, but you've already been part of this. You were chosen." Matt shudders at the words. His heart is racing. He wants to ask what it all means, but his mouth dries up, and his voice disappears in his chest. His mind is racing with 100 questions, but none of them have answers. Everything feels like a script where he's just a character. But this isn't just a game, and he understands that. This isn't just stalking. It's a test. The man continues, "I didn't choose you randomly. You have potential. And now I respect your patience. But you can't leave here without uncovering this." Matt understands that he can't leave things as they are. He's already stepped out of his comfort zone, and now, he only has one way forward. He doesn't know who this man is, but he seems to have more power and knowledge than Matt can even imagine. The man steps on the gas, and the car disappears into the darkness. Matt stands still for a few more seconds, collecting his thoughts. His mind is chaos. He knows that if he doesn't take control of the situation, his life will be ruined. And this is no longer just about fear. It's about survival. The path to the truth. Matt has no time for hesitation. He decides to act and go all the way. Instead of going home and falling into the arms of fear, he starts his own investigation. He recalls all the moments when that man appeared in his life. All those little details he hadn't noticed before. Common places, routes, times of day. He decides to go to the university and talk to anyone who might have seen this man. Maybe he can even involve his friends. In the morning, he heads to the university library, where he finds an old friend, Jason, who works in criminal research. Jason immediately notices Matt's troubled appearance. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," Jason says. "I saw a man." Matt replies, "He's been following me. And I think it's more than just stalking. I don't know who he is, but this is no coincidence. Jason agrees to help. He starts reviewing surveillance footage from the university campus. Among hundreds of hours of video, Jason finds a recording. The same man who had encountered Matt near the university is standing next to his car from a few nights ago. He's holding something dark, possibly a phone. He's recording something. This isn't a coincidence, Jason says, watching the footage. This is something bigger. This man definitely knows where you are. Matt feels something crack inside. This man isn't just stalking him, he has plans. And those plans involve more than just Matt. The encounter with the mysterious stranger, Matt decides to confront the stranger. He can't run anymore. He can't let this fear continue to control his life. And so, standing at the threshold of the building where the meeting is supposed to happen, Matt feels a wave of nervous tension rising in his chest. He hears the stranger's voice behind him. "You came, just like I thought," the man says, and his face seems ominously familiar, though Matt can't recall where he might have seen him before. "I don't want to be part of your game," Matt says. "But you can't leave the game now," the man replies. "You made a choice, and now that you understand this isn't a coincidence, you have a responsibility for everything. You need to take the last step to make everything fall into place." Matt doesn't understand what this means, but he feels that his life is changing again. This moment will be the one that defines his future. Climax: the man gives Matt a choice. He must pass the final stage of this test. If he wants to rid himself of this fear, he has to accept his role and do what the stranger commands. Like in a nightmare, he realizes that these choices have already been made for him. All that's left for him is to go all the way. And standing there, on the edge, he decides to act the way he wants to. Only now does he understand, this choice is not just about his survival, but about who he will become in the end. Matt stands at the threshold of no escape. He feels his heart pounding wildly in his chest. And although his mind wants to run, a part of him knows that this can no longer be done. He can't let this man control his life. The man has his hand on Matt's shoulder, symbolizing power, but Matt feels that he too has power in his hands. The choice: "What do you want from me?" he asks again, though he doesn't expect an answer. Everything has already been said, though in different forms. The man silently steps back a pace, as if checking Matt's reaction. Then, looking Matt in the eyes, he slowly speaks the words, "I wanted you to become stronger. And it seems you finally understand." And here, Matt realizes, everything that happened, all those vague hints and the stalking, were not just a nightmare. It was a test. The man wasn't an enemy. He was a teacher. And what seemed like an invisible threat was actually his way of helping Matt find the courage and strength within himself. This wasn't a game. It was his preparation for something much more important. "You're not afraid anymore," the stranger says, and this time his words don't sound like a threat, but like an acknowledgement. "Now you're ready for the real world, a world where every step you take matters." Matt, sighing, feels the heavy burden lift from his shoulders. All his fears and doubts dissipate. Now he knows that he's not just one of many links in this mysterious game. He himself can be the change. He has a choice: how will I know that I've passed this test? Matt asks, though he knows the answer won't be straightforward. The man smiles. A slight smile, a sign that everything is truly finished. And before disappearing into the darkness, he leaves these final words: "You already know." Matt is left alone. He stands in the same place where, just hours ago, fear and helplessness overwhelmed him. Now, he feels a sense of confidence and peace within. This is not the end. It's the beginning of a new stage. Now, he is ready to change his life and control it, rather than letting others define his path. He takes a deep breath, sighs, and moves forward, with the new understanding that his place in this world matters. And even though he may not know exactly where all this will lead, he is no longer afraid to move ahead. Now, he knows one thing: he's no longer just being chased. Now, he's the one who defines his fate. Susie woke up in the morning and looked out the window. The streets were covered in snow, and the snow falling from the sky created a stunning, almost magical landscape. A thin veil of frosty mist covered the view from her window, giving everything the appearance of a dreamy yet cold emptiness. She took a cup of hot tea and, relaxing, watched as the dawn gradually drove away the night's darkness. It was the perfect day for a walk. Today is the best day for a walk in the park, she thought. Susie dressed warmly, put on her favorite puffer jacket and boots, grabbed a scarf, and left the house. The street was almost empty, Only a few brave souls had decided to take a walk in such cold weather. The air was crisp, cold, and the scent of snow carried by the wind brought a sense of freshness. Susie's footsteps left traces in the snow as she walked toward the park. She loved these quiet moments when she could be alone with nature and think about everything that always got overlooked in everyday life. But what was this? A feeling of unease began to creep up from an unknown place. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but when she turned around, her gaze fell on a man walking a few steps behind her. He seemed ordinary, but for some reason, he wouldn't leave her alone. He was dressed in a dark jacket, a hood partially covering his face, and shoes that easily absorbed the snow, leaving traces behind. He walked evenly and without unnecessary movements, as if simply enjoying his walk, but Susie couldn't shake the inexplicable feeling that he was following her. She quickened her pace, and he did the same. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but the longer she walked, the more often his shadow appeared, just at the edge of her sight. Susie tried not to panic, thinking it could be a coincidence, but the further she went, the more hostile she felt the presence of this stranger. After a few minutes, Susie reached the central part of the park. It was quiet here, and everything around her looked like it had come from a fairy tale. The trees were covered in snow, and snowflakes continued to gently fall. She decided to walk a little further to escape the city noise, but the man was still behind her. Susie turned around and, as if by accident, looked him in the eyes. They met for a few seconds, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her heart race. There was a cold gaze, but at the same time, some dark, unexplainable feeling that passed through her skin. She hurried to leave the park, and when she looked back, she noticed he was still walking. But now the distance between them had become much smaller. Her heart sped up. She tried not to run, but quickly walked home, glancing back every few steps. The man wasn't just following her now, he was walking in her tracks, like a shadow that seemed to grow out of the ground and cling to her. Susie quickly returned home, locked the door, and threw off her puffer jacket, trying to calm down. She went to the window to look outside, trying to figure out if it had just been her imagination. She saw him. He walked past her house, almost stopping, briefly glancing at the window. She recoiled from him, then quickly averted her gaze. The man turned his head and continued walking. Susie couldn't calm down. Why didn't he keep walking? Why did he stop and look at her like he understood something about her? She stood in place, unable to tear her gaze away from him. And then suddenly, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. He just vanished from her sight, leaving no trace. She sat down on the couch, wrapped herself in a blanket, trying to understand what had happened. Was it just a coincidence? Or was something wrong after all? The feeling of an inexplicable fear hung in the air, like a shadow. And with each passing minute, Susie realized that she probably hadn't finished with him yet. The next day, Susie woke up again with a sense of unease. The night seemed to have brought no peace, and although she tried to calm herself after seeing the stranger, the inner pain wouldn't leave her. All the details that remained in her mind, the man's gaze, his shadow, the footprints in the snow, began to turn into nightmares. Over the next week, she didn't encounter the man again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he might be nearby. The days grew shorter, and the nights colder. Susie began checking the locks on the doors, keeping the windows locked when she wasn't home. She didn't know why she was reacting this way, but every time she heard strange noises at night, her heart would race. Friends who came to visit began noticing her changes. She had become closed off, nervous, her usual smiles disappeared. And though Susie tried to act calm, inside she felt that what had happened in the park wasn't just a coincidence. Soon, another shock occurred. One evening, when she returned home from work, her door was open. Panic hit her instantly. Her heart froze in her chest as she carefully entered the apartment, glancing around repeatedly. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but the feeling that someone had been there lingered. She spent the next few hours searching for any signs that something was wrong with her apartment. No matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Fear had become her constant companion. But what terrified her the most was that she couldn't find anything concrete that proved someone had been in her apartment. Even when she couldn't sleep, she felt a presence she couldn't explain. Susie decided to call the police. She told them the details about the man who had followed her in the park, and all the strange events that had started after that. But the police's response was clear: they couldn't do anything. As they said, these were just fears that anyone could experience. Her story lacked concrete evidence, and the facts she provided weren't serious enough to warrant an investigation. They advised her to consult a psychologist. Seeking a psychologist didn't bring her relief. She felt as if she was starting to lose control over her reality, and that this might not just be a figment of her imagination. After several sessions, the psychologist suggested Susie undergo treatment for post-traumatic stress. But nothing changed, the fear remained. Even when she tried to calm down, those dark thoughts wouldn't leave her. However, one evening, she received a message on her phone. It was from an unknown number: "You won't be able to escape what I'm going to do. This is not the end." The text was short and to the point, but it made her heart tighten with fear. She immediately blocked the number and called the police. But this time, the police reacted more quickly. They began an investigation, even though they had very little evidence. They speculated that it might just be someone trying to scare her, but Susie felt it was the same man she had encountered in the park. He was coming back, and this time it was more serious. With each passing day, her fear grew. Susie couldn't sleep without the light on, checking the doors and windows several times a night. She began receiving more messages and calls from unknown numbers, with no responses. There was never a clear threat, but after every call, she felt even more afraid. One evening, when Susie was at home again, hearing the phone ring, she finally dared to answer. A voice was on the line, cold, calm, without any emotion. "I know you understand now. You can't escape from me." Susie felt her heart drop. It was his voice. The same man she had met in the park. He was everywhere, and now she knew he had found her. She decided to take one final step. For all these weeks, she had been trying to find a way out. But she couldn't stay in place any longer. She knew the man was following her, and now it was a question: could she stand up to this, or was it all just an illusion of her mind? The next day, when she went outside, she saw him again. The man was standing in the darkness, in the shadows, watching her. He didn't walk toward her, didn't approach. He just stood there. And she understood that, perhaps, this would be the end. But the next morning, when she woke up, she saw that her apartment was turned upside down, and the door was open, even though she had left it locked. Susie felt that her life no longer belonged to her. Every day felt like a battle for survival, with the constant feeling that this man could be nearby at any moment. All her attempts to escape him, both physical and emotional, yielded no results. She could no longer live in constant fear, but every step she took felt helpless. After calling the police for the second time, she tried to get help. Her patience was running thin. This time, the police promised to investigate the case more actively, but Susie no longer relied on them. She decided to take matters into her own hands. One evening, she headed to the park where it all began. Was it a mistake? Susie was ready to meet him again. She took a deep breath, grabbed her phone, and ventured into the darkness. Every sound around her became so vivid, the rustling of leaves, the crunching of branches, the swishing of clothes, as she listened intently to every detail. And then, she saw him. He stood at the end of the alley, with his back to her, watching her. She could feel his gaze on her, without even looking him in the eye. Her heart raced faster. There was no time for fear now. Susie approached him, not stopping or hesitating. Her emotions burst out, and when she was close enough, her voice cracked. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" The man slowly turned to face her. His face was hard to recognize in the dark, but the expression in his eyes was cold and ruthless. "You've understood that I'll always be here. It's not just your phobia. I'm here because I need you. And you won't be able to leave." From those words, from that shadow that formed between them, Susie felt a faint gust of air that seemed heavy, even physically heavy. It was the moment when she realized that this man wasn't just following her, he was embodying her nightmare, and he was her fear. But this time, Susie didn't back down. She must have been ready for this moment, because her determination and anger from being his victim for so long overwhelmed her. Suddenly, she saw him move. He started toward her, but not at the speed she expected. He was slow, as if enjoying her fear. This was his usual method, playing with people, tearing them apart with his piercing gaze and psychological pressure. And then Susie did what she had to do. She lunged at him, grabbing his arm. He lifted her, like a puppet, and for a moment, she lost her bearings. But she didn't let him take control. She struck him in the face, hard as she could. The blow made him recoil, and in that instant, she broke free from his grip. At that moment, she realized that, in truth, fear was something he had imposed on her. He was not stronger than her will. After that night, everything changed. Susie was shaken both physically and emotionally. She was no longer the person she was before meeting him. She still felt the residual fear, but that moment became her victory, a victory not over the man, but over her own demons. She had been able to stand up to him, even though she didn't know if he was a real threat or just a product of her imagination. A few days later, the police finally found him. He was arrested. It turned out that he was no random passerby, but a sick psychopath who had been stalking people for years, including Susie, selecting his victims. And although he was no longer physically present, the remnants of his shadow remained in her mind. Susie went to a psychologist to work through what had happened and how she could live with it. But she was stronger now. She understood that she had faced her greatest fear. And at the moment when he was behind her, she knew, her battle had been won, though at a very high cost.